People love to say that there are not any good movies anymore. You see it in comment sections. People have said it in my comment sections, in reviews, in almost basically every discussion about the state of the industry. People will say shit like, oh, movies back in the old days, they used to be better. The writing was sharper, the ideas were fresher, and the industry was willing to take more risks. Now we're in hell, and everything feels repetitive and overproduced and forgettable, and we all might as well die, because there's never going to be another good movie ever. The short answer to that question of whether, television movies are getting worse is yes, if you're not looking. The long answer is hell no. But for the sake of the former, we're going to focus on mainstream stuff or we'd be here forever. If you focus on mainly large mainstream releases, especially big franchises and constant sequels, then it becomes very easy to see why that idea exists. And to be fair, there are reasons for that perception. I think blockbusters dominate modern cinema, even if we don't have an actual blockbuster anymore, in a way that is hard to ignore. And when people talk about the state of movies, they are often talking about these large mainstream productions. I think one of the clearest examples is the trajectory of superhero films. When modern superhero cinema really began to establish itself in the early 2000s, many of the defining films felt like serious creative efforts rather than just franchise entries. Batman Begins is a good example. Christopher Nolan approached the character with a very specific visual style and a grounded tone that separated it from earlier comic adaptations. It felt like a director-driven film that happened to use a superhero story as its foundation. As this genre expanded, however, the structure of these films began to change. By the mid 2010s-ish, most of these superhero movies existed primarily as pieces within a larger franchise. Films like Avengers Age of Ultron or Ant-Man, they're still entertaining, I guess, but they often felt designed to move a larger storyline. Everything led to Endgame and they just had to let you know that every 5 minutes. And stuff like Wonder Woman was just utter fucking shit. In the most recent phase, I feel like that's only intensified. Films like Thunderbolts and the new Fantastic Four, as much as I enjoyed them and I thought they were pretty good, exist within an ecosystem where every release is connected to several others. Although saying that, I do think Thunderbolts and Fantastic Four can be watched alone. I don't know if you have to watch 80 other films and 3 series to get them. I still feel like they're less distinctive though. Give it 5 years and it will be shoved into an era or a phase. Another pattern on the movies getting worse argument is sequel fatigue. The Now You See Me trilogy is a fairly clear example of how this process can work. The first film is not a masterpiece, but it has a genuinely entertaining premise. Stage magicians using elaborate tricks and illusions to commit large-scale heists. It's fast-paced, it's visually energetic. Jesse Eisenberg plays Jesse Eisenberg, and it's built around a concept that feels fresh enough to sustain one single movie. One movie. The second movie, which they should have named Now to See Me, but they didn't, still follows the same basic formula, but the sense of novelty has started to fade it off already. The plot becomes convoluted. Harry Potter is there, and much of the excitement from the first film is replaced by attempts to escalate the scale of tricks. We are now at the third film. The story becomes unnecessarily complicated without becoming more interesting. There are 3 new people that we have to follow, and the original 5 too. Too many. That is too many people. It feels like a very unnatural endpoint of a franchise that was never really designed to last this long. Was the third film bad? Yes. It was bad. But Dominic Sessa is in it, so all is forgiven. He really needs to stop being in bad movies though. It gets to a point. More broadly though, the pattern is familiar. Many franchises begin with a strong, entertaining premise, and then each sequel becomes a little less focused than the last. The result is a long series of diminishing returns. Come on man, how many Fast and Furious movies do we need? Surely they've become the fastest and the furiousest by now. Literary adaptations don't really help either. Take Pride and Prejudice from 2005. That film is remembered because it is just fantastic, and McFadden is only hot in that context. The cinematography and the pacing and the performances all contribute to a very clear sense of tone. It feels very carefully constructed with a very distinct visual and emotional identity. By contrast, some recent adaptations can feel really shit. in comparison to that one. The new adaptation of Wuthering Heights, which I mean, I've already bitched about that on here before, it was shit. That's the short version of my argument. It was really bad. The issue wasn't really that the film was badly made. Like, clearly a lot of time and effort went into that movie. It feels like it exists because it's a recognizable literary property, and I guess that's a safe investment. I think that this reinforces the idea that the industry is becoming more repetitive and less creative when adaptations feel like algorithmic decisions rather than artistic ones. Taken together, I think these patterns help explain why so many people think that movies are declining in quality. Large franchises often dominate these conversations, and sequels are becoming weaker over time, and adaptations of familiar stories can sometimes feel less distinctive than earlier versions. If you focus only on these trends, the conclusion seems fairly straightforward. Movies look like they are getting worse. Or, maybe it's a streaming problem. Over the past decade, the way that films are produced and distributed have changed dramatically. Streaming platforms now dominate the entertainment landscape, and those platforms operate on a very different model than traditional cinema. Instead of releasing a smaller number of films designed to succeed at a box office, streaming services need a constant flow of new material to keep subscribers engaged. This demand for constant output inevitably is going to affect the kind of projects that get made. I think a useful and very popular example of this is the comparison between the 2005 War of the Worlds and the 2025 one. Someone thought that that was a good idea, and nobody suggested otherwise. The 2005 version is directed by Steven Spielberg, and it feels unmistakably cinematic. The film has scale, and the destruction sequences feel massive and chaotic, but they're also staged with a clear sense of geography and tension. Smaller moments in the film are designed to create an atmosphere and suspense. It is a blockbuster that was built to be experienced on a very large screen. The newer version of War of the Worlds feels very different. I mean, it's literally Ice Cube in a room on a Zoom call, clicking about his computer and FaceTiming his daughter while she gives birth, and also Amazon saves the day. It's also edited like shit, and the dialogue is fucking awful. It is disposable. It exists. It appears briefly in a streaming catalogue, and then it quickly disappears beneath the next wave of releases. I haven't heard anyone mention it in forever. It's just gone. The difference highlights a very large structural change in the industry, I think. Streaming platforms are not necessarily trying to produce fewer films of extremely high quality. They're trying to produce a very large number of films that can appeal to literally anyone, so everybody keeps watching them. They are turning us into iPad kids. When the goal becomes constant production, the result is often inconsistency. Some projects turn out well, but many others feel rushed and underdeveloped or visually smaller than their theatrical counterparts. Seriously, why is Ice Cube? Out of all the people they could have picked, why Ice Cube? This next point is kind of similar to my Now You See Me movie points, but in general, I think movies feel very repetitive. The argument being that Hollywood has simply run out of ideas and that new films are often just slight variations on stories that already exist. I realised this with Press Play starring Lewis Pullman and The Greatest Hits with David Corenswet. On the surface, they are very separate projects with different casts and different directors, but when you look at the basic structure of the story, not even the down to intimate details of this story, they are the exact same movie. Both movies revolve around a character, a blonde woman, dealing with grief after losing someone close to them, and they both introduce a form of time travel connected to music, and in both cases, the central emotional drive of the story is an attempt to return to the past and change something that went wrong. Both are able to interact with their past memory boyfriends, and then both are able to save them, but now, the catch is, the present alive boyfriend doesn't know who they are. They follow the same structure, down to very small. It's so weird. I thought I was insane when I thought I'd watched the same movie twice because I hadn't heard anyone talk about how identical they are. Movies like that, I think, reinforce the sense that the industry is repeating itself. If multiple films with a nearly identical premises exist within a few years of each other, it is so easy to conclude that originality is just disappearing. I don't think this pattern is new. Hollywood has always followed trends. When one type of film succeeds, studios look for a way to replicate that. If a particular concept proves popular with audiences, other projects with similar ideas often appear afterwards. This has happened across every genre: disaster films, romantic comedies, dystopian sci-fis, and superhero movies. It happens everywhere. I think, in other words, repetition in Hollywood is not necessarily a sign that creativity has collapsed. It's often a sign that studios are just responding to what they believe audience wants to see. Like what will make them the most money. YouTubers do it as well. Beast Games is just Squid Games but blue. I think what has changed though is how visible this repetition has become. More films are being released through theaters and streaming platforms at the same time, and these similarities are easier to notice. We're going to talk about writing. I think a lot of people feel that modern television and movies have become increasingly direct in how they present their ideas. Themes that might have once been implied through character actions or visual storytelling are now very explicitly explained through dialogue. This pattern appears in a number of recent productions, in films like The Running Man or Superman, or I'd go as far to say like later seasons of The Boys as well. The thematic message is very frequently delivered in a clear, direct language. Characters openly discuss moral or political ideas that the story is exploring, to the point where they could just turn to the camera and tell us what the fuck is between the lines, because clearly we don't know. I think some recent episodes of Black Mirror also follow a very similar pattern. Early entries in the series often relied on unsettling premises and ambiguous conclusions. The audience was left to consider the implications of the story without necessarily being given a clear statement of its meaning. I think some later episodes, especially in the most recent season, feel very explicit. I don't think the themes are uninteresting. Many of these address important cultural and technological concerns. The criticism is that storytelling can feel way less subtle than it used to be. I think a useful comparison can be found in older films and TV series that are often praised for their writing. David Fincher's Zodiac or Seven, or basically anything by him, is a really good example. Seven clearly deals with themes of morality and punishment and human corruption, but it rarely stops to explain those ideas directly. Instead, these themes emerge through characters and the atmosphere and the unfolding investigation. The audience is expected to draw its own conclusions about what the story ultimately means. Early seasons of Game of Thrones as well functions in a similar way. The political and moral themes of the show are present throughout the story, but they are rarely explained in straightforward terms. Instead, the audience sees how different characters interpret power and loyalty and justice, and the larger themes become visible through those conflicts. And then everything kind of goes to shit after season 7, but we don't talk about that. I think these show a degree of trust in the audience. The writers assume that the viewers can interpret the story without needing constant explanation. When a script repeatedly clarifies its own message, the sense of discovery can disappear. Instead of gradually understanding the themes of a story, the audience is simply told what those themes are. I don't think it's necessarily a wrong thing, considering the literacy crisis we're in. I bet it's better to be safe than sorry, I guess. The difference may seem small, but it can have a significant effect on how film or TV feels. Subtle storytelling invites interpretation and discussion, and direct storytelling often closes that space entirely. Good writing allows the audience to recognize the idea on their own, and weak writing explains the idea before the audience even has a chance to find it. I think films and TV also looks worse than they used to. I've seen a ton of people complaining about how dark movies are. Not intentionally dark. I mean, you gotta sit in a dark room and turn the brightness all the way up to see what's happening. Another thing is that color palettes have become increasingly muted. Instead of vibrant or varied colors, many movies rely heavily on grey or very desaturated tones. It's playing it safe. Lighting can also feel flatter than it once did. I had some criticisms about Heated Rivalry and how corporate and commercial-like it felt, and then I got absolutely hounded. So I'm not saying that your show is bad, but the lighting was an interesting choice. Rather than strong contrasts or visually striking compositions, Some modern films appear evenly lit in a way that makes the image feel way less dynamic. Dialogue is another point of criticism as well. Lines are delivered in a very quiet and naturalistic style. The result is that these characters are very difficult to understand without subtitles. They're always fucking mumbling. I think many earlier movies had very distinctive colour palettes and clearer lighting strategies. Scenes were often staged in ways that emphasised visual clarity and strong composition. Even with similar genres, different actors tended to produce images that looked recognisably different from one another. Maybe it was to make up for worse cameras or something, I don't know. I'm tired of it. There are still many modern directors that create visually striking work, but when people talk about modern movies looking worse, this is what they are usually referring to. Despite the last 15 minutes of me going on about how shit modern movies are, there is one major flaw in the argument. When people make this comparison, they're not comparing like with like. What happens is that we compare the best films and shows from the past with the very average releases of the present. Over time, the weaker movies from earlier decades tend to just disappear from cultural memory. They are rarely rewatched and they are rarely discussed and rarely recommended. What remains are obviously going to be the standout titles, the shit that was memorable enough to survive. Have you ever heard anyone mention The Way of the Gun with Benicio del Toro or the 2003 Daredevil? No. It was mid. It was forgotten. In any given year, even in periods people now consider strong for cinema, there were still plenty of forgettable releases. Most of them just faded away. This creates like a very distorted comparison. When we talk about the past, we're usually talking about the highlights. When we talk about the present, we're talking about everything that is currently visible, including the average and the mediocre. I watched or actually skimmed the Critical Drinker's video about this, and he mentioned how you could tell him exactly what old movies these famous phrases are from. Therefore, movies now are shit. But he's picking from the possibly thousands of shit movies that were released in those years that everybody just forgot about. I don't think that having like a famous phrase is indicative of good writing, but that's neither here nor there. He's got some good points about how this generation doesn't really have these like massive cultural shifting movies. From the top of my head, Twilight, maybe, although I guess you could write that off because it is a bit shit. Pirates of the Caribbean, I've never watched it, but everybody around me has watched it. You know, they'll say something and I'll go, oh, what's that from? And they'll go, have you never seen Pirates of the Caribbean? No, I haven't. But I guess you could say that's still like very early. So The Hunger Games, I feel like that's absolutely massive. Nobody stops talking about The Hunger Games. It came out like 10 years ago. Everyone's talking about it. There are still new movies coming out. Hamilton, if you could count that as a movie. There was a pro shot released. Instead of going out and getting laid, I watched it on my 16th birthday. I think Hamilton has very much changed the course of musicals forever. So if you want to count that one, you can. But in general, we don't really have massive, like, culturally defining movies, so I'll give him that. If you look closely at recent years, there are still many strong films and TV being produced. I love Sinners. If you haven't watched my video on that, where I basically just glazed it for 20 minutes, I love Sinners. The film received a lot of attention, but it also produced a very interesting reaction online, I think. Some people, particularly one dude in my comment section, argued that it was essentially the same concept as Dusk Till Dawn. There are similarities in the premise, and the comparison is understandable, but similarity in concept does not necessarily mean the films function the same way. Even with that comparison in mind, I think Sinners stands on its own perfectly fine. It is very engaging, and it's very well executed. I think Dusk Till Dawn was great, but I also think about Sinners at least every other day. I love Sinners. Shows like Severance or Pluribus demonstrate that modern TV is still capable of producing complex, carefully constructed storytelling. The premise is unusual, and the tone is distinctive, and the world of the show is built with a very clear sense of purpose. Stuff like that makes it harder to argue that the entire industry is declining. Strong work is still being produced. The difference is that it may not always be coming from the most obvious or heavily marketed places. TV does complicate the argument that screen storytelling is declining. Over the past decade, TV has produced a very large number of shows that are ambitious in terms of writing and structure and visual style. Like I said before about Severance, the premise itself is unusual and conceptually ambitious. A world in which employees separate their work memories from their personal memories. That's very cool. The show builds an entire narrative around that idea, and gradually it expands the implications while maintaining a very specific tone and visual identity. It's slow and controlled and deliberate and structured in a way that trusts the audience to engage with the mystery. But I guess the question is how it compares to earlier landmark television series. Is Severance better than the OG Daredevil? Is it better than Better Call Saul? I think those shows represent very different approaches to television storytelling, but both are widely considered examples of very strong writing and direction. There is not a clear answer to that comparison. Different people will have different preferences, and each show operates within a very different genre and narrative structure. I personally have a very unhealthy obsession with Daredevil. I will pick it over anything. I think if modern series like Severance can reasonably be placed alongside shows like Better Call Saul or Breaking Bad or early Game of Thrones, maybe it suggests that television as a medium is still producing work at a very high level. In other words, the existence of these kinds of comparisons indicate that strong storytelling has not disappeared. It's still being made, and in many cases is still finding a large audience. Maybe movies aren't getting worse. Maybe we're getting worse at watching them. The way people take in media now has changed drastically over the past decade. Short form content now dominates these large parts of the internet. YouTube Shorts and TikToks and Instagram Reels, although who the fuck scrolls through Instagram Reels? They are built around videos that last like 10 seconds, and the entire structure of those platforms encourages like super mega brain rot. I'd be surprised if anyone had actually watched to this point in the video. Hi, if you have, hello. At the same time, watching how films and TV have become much more fragmented, it is now very common for people to watch a movie while also just being on their phone. When that becomes the normal way of watching something, it changes how the experience feels. Slower scenes can feel unnecessary, quiet dialogue can feel boring, and subtle visual details can go completely unnoticed. If someone is only absorbing half of what is happening on screen, the film itself is going to appear less engaging than it actually is. So, maybe the question is, are movies getting worse? Or maybe you're just on your phone for the entire goddamn thing, huh? Maybe we're all becoming iPad kids and they're just accommodating for us. How nice of them. We'll come back to the original question of, are movies and TV getting worse? I don't know. I don't have a solid answer for that. There are genuine changes in the industry that contribute to the perception that quality has declined. Streaming platforms require a constant flow of content. Large franchises dominate the mainstream conversation, and long-running series can begin to feel repetitive over time. Writing has become more explicit. Visually, many films share similar color palettes and digital aesthetics with IKEA show homes. Films are often watched on smaller screens, and sometimes while doing other things, and like a million other arguments. All of these are going to contribute to the sense that something has changed, but none of them necessarily mean that great movies are no longer being made. Every year still produces films with strong performances and striking cinematography and thoughtful storytelling. There are still directors experimenting with style, writers building complex narratives, and actors delivering memorable work. The difference is that these films do not always occupy the same cultural space that they once did. Instead of being the most visible releases, they can sometimes be buried within a much larger landscape of content. I think you've just gotta look. Also, if you made it to this point, please tell me your favorite movie. I need some more to watch. Thanks! Bye!